This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
Let me tell you about the official coffee of the Counterflow podcast, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee over at lorenzotti.coffee. I drink Lorenzotti coffee every morning. It's that damn good. They are a great company run by very like-minded individuals. And what they do is they get their coffee beans imported directly from Italy. Then they package it up, vacuum seal it, of course, and it's ready to be shipped right to you. You got to go check out their storefront at lorenzotti.coffee. They've got these great looking coffee grinders. They've got beautiful tins that you can get the coffee shipped in and keep it there on your kitchen counter. That's kind of what I do, actually. They've got pre-ground, whole bean, 12 packs, 5 packs, 3 packs. Really, any amount you may need, you will find it on their site. It's LORENZOTTI.coffee. You are loyal listeners to this show. They are loyal supporters of this show, which means you get a discount. Type in promo code BUCK at checkout and you will get 10% off of your order. That's BUCK, B-U-C-K, at checkout for 10% off of your order when you go to lorenzotti.coffee. See you there? Drink it every morning while you listen to this show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up? What's up? What's up? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow podcast. Thank you guys for the support. It's been growing and you guys have been really nice and supportive. So I appreciate that. Today, I've got CJ Killmer on the show. He hosts the Dangerous History podcast. He's a college professor, and it's refreshing to know that he's doing that they're actually allowing someone who essentially teaches the red-pilled real version of history in a college. They're actually allowing it. Can you believe that? And thank you for your service in that manner, CJ. He's been teaching college history since 2006. He likes to say he's a smartass, iconoclast, and a cynical questioner and critic of authority since he was a kid. Naturally, these attitudes have influenced his take on history. The Dangerous History podcast is what he does. He's the proprietor of that. It's a very good podcast. The hours and amount of time that CJ puts into that show, once you find it and you start listening, you'll see that it's got to be overwhelming, but he does an excellent job. The goal of the Dangerous History podcast is to help you learn the past so that you can better understand the present and prepare for the future. The Dangerous History podcast takes CJ's countless hours spent as a professional history dork and boils all the most interesting and important stuff he has learned into podcast episodes, combining education with entertainment with the ultimate goal of empowerment. I think he succeeds at that ultimate goal quite well. He's here with us today, CJ Killmer. Professor Killmer, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to talk to you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to get you here. We're going to get into your passion of education and history, but your podcast is called Dangerous History. I suppose, could we call it maybe a red-pilled version of American history?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And I've been using that metaphor in various ways for probably 15 years now. I used to even pull up at the start of some of my classes that I teach, I used to pull up the Matrix clip even to kind of be like, look, this is basically, I'm Morpheus and you're Neo, and you better strap in because you're going to hear aspects of American history or world history or whatever it is we were doing that you've never heard anywhere else before.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to get into with this chat with you. So before we get into your education, your past, what you're doing now, let's just get into it and drop a red pill on the audience right now regarding anything you want about American history or the education system, whatever pops in your mind first.
Okay, well, I think I can make a point about the schooling system that also can be applied to a lot of other institutions as well. And so I'd start off with the H.L. Mencken quote that I had at the beginning of my recent episode where I talked a bit about progressivism, kind of progressivism version 1.0, early 20th century progressivism, and what it did to kind of refashion American public schooling. And the quote comes from H.L. Mencken, and very much a critic of pretty much everything, including the public schooling system. And so Mencken said, "The most erroneous assumption is to the effect that the aim of public education is to fill the young in the species with knowledge and awaken their intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The whole aim of public education is not to spread enlightenment at all. It is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and originality. That is its aim in the United States, whatever the pretensions of the politicians, and that is its aim everywhere else." Okay, so this is, approximately 100 years ago, Mencken said that. And so my take, which is pretty much the same, just expressed differently as his, is that you've got to uncover the real purposes of powerful and influential institutions. And very often their real purposes, their real functions, their real jobs are very different from the kind of standard public cover story of what it is they're supposedly up to, right? And so, if for example, you looked at the Federal Reserve, right? What's the official story of why the Federal Reserve is there and what it's doing? It's something like, well, it's there to help moderate the fluctuations of the business cycle, to kind of smooth out the boom and bust. It's there maybe to bolster employment, and it's there to backstop the value of the dollar or to preserve the purchasing power of the dollar, something like that, right? And then if you look at, if you accept that that's actually what the Fed is there for, then it's doing a horrific job, right? It's failing as an institution. But if instead you read Creature from Jekyll Island and all those sorts of things, and Rothbard's works about the Fed and all those sorts of sources, you realize, oh, actually that was never the real reason for the Fed to begin with, from the guys who designed it, right? That really what it's there for is things like to subsidize Wall Street, to bail out Wall Street when they need it, and then to help facilitate the federal government being able to finance larger deficits and to be able to just, create money when necessary, all that sort of, that's what it's there for, right? And the same, like the Pentagon, the national security state, all that stuff, right? The story is, oh, that's there to protect the American people and the American nation and protect your freedom and all these sorts of things. And then you look into that, you get sort of red pilled on that. And you realize, like, that's not what that stuff is about at all. That's more there for, well, a combination of sort of to extract tons of wealth from the taxpayer for certain, corporations and things like that. And for the Pentagon itself to have, more toys and prestige and whatever. And it's also there to then go abroad and carry out the wishes of the corporate and political elites of the country, right? And so if you think, that, I don't know, when American troops are sent into some Latin American country in the early 20th century, that they're actually there to protect Americans' freedom or whatever, you realize pretty quickly, oh no, they're there to protect United Fruit or whatever. And so anyway, circling back to education, I'd say the same thing, right? That if, you hear people very often say, oh, our school system is failing, right? And it depends on what you think it's there to do. If you think it's there to produce like genuinely educated people in the idealistic sense of the word, right? People who are better when they come out than when they went in, not just because they know more stuff, that's part of it, but because, they've been encouraged to develop their human potential as an individual and to find their talents and passions and pursue them, and to come out as an effective person who's able to think for themselves very well and able to really, maximize their potential in life and all that, then you'd have to say that the system is pretty disastrous. Not that the occasional person doesn't come through it relatively intact and capable, but that doesn't seem to me, at least, what the majority of people coming out of the system on the far end are up to. And instead, what it's really there for is to manage the population. It's there, and in that recent episode, I shared a bunch of from their own from their own mouths, the progressive education reformers of the late 19th and early 20th century, that they were very upfront, and anyone listening can go read things like the works of John Taylor Gatto, people like that, to get just tons and tons and tons of detail on this. But that it's designed, number one, to indoctrinate certain beliefs that the elites feel is desirable to indoctrinate. And secondly, it's to inculcate the overall habits or kind of the meta lessons of submission, obedience, and conformity. And that if you understand that that's really the intended purpose of the guys who actually designed the system, and that's, when you create a system to do a certain thing, it's going to do that regardless of if people come along later who aren't in on the initial conspiracy, if we want to use that word, right? Not everybody who's involved in, being a public school teacher or administrator or whatever, it's not that they're all in on some sinister conspiracy and they all understand, like, oh yeah, we're indoctrinating the kids and hobbling their intellectual development. But they don't need to be, because the system was designed to do what it does. And so, if you understand what the real intentions were of the guys who designed this thing, and you ask the question, is this system working? Then it's doing a great job, just like the Pentagon is doing a great job at its actual function. The CIA is doing a great job at its real function. Police are doing a great job at their actual function. And the Federal Reserve is doing a bang-up job of what its real function is.
In your experience, I know you're steeped in the education system, so to speak. Has the last year kind of, would you say, red pilled more people on this actual topic? Do more people seem like, wait a second, this isn't what I thought, now that I am doing things offline, or now that parents are hearing certain lessons taught to their kids, maybe people figure out I don't need to go sit in a chair for 8 hours a day and get this stuff thrown into me. Does it seem like more people are waking up to that point?
I think so. What the numbers are, the percentages are, the proportions are, I've got no idea. It may not be that big of a percent of people who are really going to have a lasting effect from this. I think, it's very common for people to have sort of like a partial awakening or a partial red pilling moment, but then after a little while to just kind of revert back to, where they were before. This is a common thing. We've all probably had those experiences, right? Where you're talking to a friend or relative who has a very different worldview than you, and it seems like you persuade them of something important, right? You give them a red pill, at least on some particular issue or topic or whatever. And you're like, all right, in your head, you're thinking, we're making progress. All right. Uncle so-and-so, cousin such and such. Yeah. He's kind of getting it now. He's starting to see, put on the they live glasses that I have and to see things for what they are. And then you don't see him for a few weeks. And next time you bump into him, it's like your red pill conversation from a while ago never even happened. So I think that as things reopen, I'm in Florida, so we're mostly have been reopened for a long time. I know you in Texas have fully reopened fairly recently. How long is it going to take, even for people who did have some amount of a aha moment about this, to, just get back into the groove, right? Just get back into the path of least resistance. And in a way, I have sympathy, because, if you're working a full-time job and you've got kids and you don't, realistically have any capability to keep them out of the system, once lockdowns are ended, like I get it, and we don't get to choose where we are in life when we wake up to something like this, right? I mean, it's one thing if it's very early in your life, you don't have kids yet, whatever, and you figure this stuff out, and then you're able to, from the beginning, be like, all right, I'm going to, raise my kids unschooling or whatever, you want to do. It's another thing entirely if you're already, in middle age, maybe have a kid or multiple kids, and, you've got all sorts of bills to pay and debts and whatever, and, working your ass off a bunch of hours a week to do it. It's like, then even if you do figure out what the system is up to, realistically, it might not be feasible for you to do anything about it. At least in time, for your, like, if you already have a 15-year-old kid and you figure this stuff out, probably even if you wanted to make the major changes to your lifestyle and your career and whatever to accommodate alternative education, realistically, you probably couldn't get it done by the time the kid would be graduating high school anyway. So, but yeah, I definitely think there's been some upside in that, at least in some instances, you hear parents saying things about, oh, I realize my kid can knock out the real, schoolwork in an hour, and then be off for the rest of the day. What's he doing the other 6 hours that he's normally at school, right?
Right.
Or they see, over the Zoom or whatever, they see, I don't know, some like really wacky, ideologically driven lesson, like someone's teaching woke math or something like that, right? And the parents previously would have had probably no idea unless their kid happened to tell them about it, right? And so then they see it beamed into their home through the Zoom and they go, whoa, what the hell's going on here, right? How did math get woke, right? This is supposed to have nothing to do with it.
Yeah. It got woke slowly, and then all of a sudden quickly. Let's talk about what you do. You teach in a university, is that correct?
Yeah, it's technically not a university. It's technically what used to be called a community college, although these days they're usually not called that anymore. But yeah, it's like basically a community college, although we do have a couple of bachelor programs. So technically we get to be called a state college.
Is it hard to break into the university system teaching from your perspective?
Yes. Academia is, first off, it's extremely rigid as a caste system. And what I mean by that is it's just, they're super hardcore, rigid, and legalistic about your degrees and what jobs you can or cannot get based on your degree in a variety of ways. So I'm basically like the academic equivalent of a senior NCO in the military, right? I'm not a commissioned officer. Commissioned officers in academia are PhD people. I don't have a PhD. My degrees only go as high as a master's, and then I have a few credits beyond a master's, but I don't have a full PhD. And so with those credentials, I can teach. The job I have is basically the highest I can go in academia, is full-time at a community college. I can teach as an adjunct at a fancier like university in some cases, but they'll only, let me teach 1 or 2 classes as an adjunct. They would never hire me for full-time, even if they like me. I previously taught at a fairly fancy, not super fancy, but fairly fancy private college as an adjunct. And I taught a couple classes a semester there. And I was actually doing this at actually 2 different pretty nice private colleges, where I teach 2 classes in the morning at one college and then drive and go teach 2 classes at the other. And I got good feedback from my supervisors and from my students at those schools. And, generally thought I was doing well. But then when a full-time job opened up at one of them, and I asked the guy who was basically my supervisor, like, hey, I know I don't have a PhD, but I've been working here already for a year and doing a bang-up job and getting good reviews. Should I throw in my application for this position? And he just flat out said, like, no, like, and it's not that it was him personally. He, as far as I could tell, liked me and everything, and probably would have encouraged me, but he was just like, just flat out, they won't even look at your resume if you don't have a PhD. So academia is difficult like that. And also your degree has to be very specific. Your degree and your classes have to be very specifically matched up to whatever it is you're teaching. So, if you have a degree in, I don't know, European history, there's other types of history that they flat out won't let you teach because it's not in your specialty. So academia is very much about specialization, and then about rigid sort of hierarchies of degrees and that sort of thing. And then there's the ideological component, right? Which is that academia in America has been dominated by kind of center-left progressivism for well over a century now. A lot of people think that the progressive takeover of academia is something that happened pretty recently. Maybe it happened in the 1960s, or some people seem to think it happened like in the last decade or two or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, if you go back to like the last couple decades of the 19th century, academia was already largely just completely taken over in America by the progressive ideology. You know, people like Woodrow Wilson and Richard T. Ely and all these sorts of characters. And, you know, basically it's overwhelmingly center-left progressive, kind of running from Joe Biden to Bernie Sanders on the spectrum there. And then a small percentage of people who are like outright Marxists, although the outright Marxists are a minority in academia usually. And then there's like, you know, a trifling amount of conservatives and libertarians, far fewer than there are Marxists, you know, and in most cases it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, I happen to have known and worked with a few conservative and libertarian historians in various ways, but they're very much a tiny minority. And this is particularly a problem in the so-called social sciences and humanities, which, you know, some schools place history and social sciences, some place it in humanities. But the reason why this is an especially big problem in those sorts of subjects is that when you're dealing with something like history or something similar like political science, the ideology of the person doing it is really important to what they're going to produce in terms of lectures and articles and books or whatever is their output, right? Whatever it is they're producing as far as content, because there's no way to do, say, history the way you could do physics, where you could be relatively objective about it and where you could do things like run controlled experiments in order to test particular theories and things. So as a result, there's no way to do that sort of stuff with a topic like history. And so that ends up making it so that a person's ideology significantly is going to mold every step of the process, from the beginning of like, okay, what topics am I going to research in the first place, to what sources am I going to consider consulting and what sources am I going to, you know, not look into. And then of course it continues to influence what you're producing right up to the end, where you're actually writing up your book or your article or whatever you're producing. And so it's a particular problem. I think it's a problem in any discipline if there's way too much ideological kind of conformity and kind of a monocrop ideological environment. But in a discipline like the social sciences, it's especially bad because, you know, when there's not ideological diversity, then there's not checking and balancing going on within the discipline. Mm-hmm. There's you know, nobody to kind of point out the holes and the gaps and the problems with the typical kind of center left historical narrative, who has the credentials, you know, to be a part of the club. You know, they're there, but they're so small in number that it doesn't really matter. So yeah, it's definitely a very conformist and largely inbred place as far as ideology and worldview.
Let me tell you about our newest sponsor here on the Counterflow podcast, and that is domesticterroristclothing.com. During the 1850s, Harriet Tubman guided about 70 slaves to their freedom. In defiance of the norms at that time, she surely earned the designation of domestic terrorist. Defy your masters with a shirt bearing this brave woman, centered between the words domestic terrorist. These tees and hoodies are available in a variety of colors that fit like a well-loved favorite. Super soft cotton and an excellent quality print makes you fall in love with it over and over again. And I'll tell you about the guys behind this company, domesticterroristclothing.com. They, like many of us in the liberty movement, are concerned with the fact that, well, half the country is being labeled domestic terrorists now. This label is being applied to hardworking, average people like you and me and all of our neighbors, all of my listeners. We know that we are being hit with that label? Well, the guys at domesticterroristclothing.com, their intention is to reappropriate this label and normalize it and remove the negative connotation. They want to see their brand on people from all walks of life. So when the blue-checked, blue-pilled lefties label you a domestic terrorist, you can smile and say, why, yes, I am, knowing that there are millions just like you. Find them on Facebook, Twitter, Gab, and Minds. Get your items at domesticterroristclothing.com. You can use promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, for a 10% discount on all items. Let's get back to the show.
It must be tough dealing with the topic of history as you do, because I said on a recent podcast, if the news is fake, and I think a lot of us realize that much of it is, imagine history, because we know this reporting of quote unquote facts on the ground as they are supposed to be seen and meant to be pushed upon people. That's not a 2020 thing. That's not new. Like you're saying, even education system itself has been taken over long time ago, much longer of a time than that a lot of us kind of, it's like we think sometimes, hey, in the 60s, everything went to shit. But this has been planned and in incremental steps along the way for a long time. And so if the news is fake, imagine history. So how do you parse through American history to be able to find and try to figure out what actually happened? And then it may look completely different than what your students coming into your class have been taught before. How do you do this? And what resources? I assume, books by Rothbard might be helpful, and there's got to be a lot of resources out there that you can find, but how do you do that? Is that quite the challenge?
Yeah, well, my approach is I basically am the opposite of the typical academic historian in like almost every way, literally. But one of the ways that I'm the opposite of most academic historians is I'm very much a generalist. I don't like to just, spend 20 years studying one super narrow niche. I'm a historian of early 19th century labor history, or I'm an historian of 1960s feminist history, or whatever. Like that's so much of academia is these super duper narrow specializations. And I'm glad there are people out there who are specialized, because a lot of times I can benefit from their research. But my preference, just I guess sort of by personality, is to always be looking into different things, and kind of, studying one topic over here, then studying one topic over there. This is one of the reasons I decided not to get a PhD, was because I would have had to have super specialized to do so. But because I'm kind of much more omnivorous in the subjects I look into, and I'm pretty much interested in almost anything potentially. I think that allows me sometimes to put together things that specialists, regardless of their ideology, would miss, even if they were trying to be, very, very fair and not deliberately trying to be ideologically slanted or whatever. And I also, I don't just read. I appreciate Rothbard and people like that for sure, who've had a big influence on me. But I also spend a lot of time reading like respectable quote unquote history. I spend a lot of time reading books by highly credentialed, respected professors that are published by academic publishers and that sort of thing, because sometimes they don't realize the implications of some of what they've uncovered. And so it's not that they always are missing the facts. It's just sometimes they haven't seen the connections the way someone like me would, who's coming at it, number one, with a totally different ideological, starting point, and number two, coming at it from the point of view of a generalist, from the point of view of someone who's studied many different topics in history, and so therefore is able to see connections and parallels and things that the specialist just would totally miss. And I'll give you an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. I've been working for several years now on an ongoing series on the life and career of Woodrow Wilson that's already like a zillion hours long, and I only just got him elected to the presidency, so it's going to be another billion hours or whatever. And as part of that, I've read a whole bunch of different biographies of Woodrow Wilson. And there was a particular, what I at least considered a bombshell that I shared on a recent Woodrow Wilson episode dealing with his time as governor of New Jersey before he became president. I uncovered that not only that he, as governor of New Jersey, signed a eugenics signed a eugenics bill into law, but I also learned that his point man on the eugenics law and on eugenics policies in New Jersey was a doctor from Central Europe who then, after being in New Jersey during the time Wilson was governor and being a doctor there in favor of eugenics, he then later moved back to Europe and ultimately ended up a prisoner of the Nazis. This guy, I'm blanking on his name, is a very complicated Central European sounding name. He was part Jewish, but he was also a hardcore eugenicist. And so because he was part Jewish, he ultimately ended up getting arrested by the Nazis and put into one of the camps. But because he was such a eugenics expert and such a eugenics proponent, he ended up collaborating with the Nazis even while he was in their custody. So he was sort of like a, like a trustee or whatever like that. And he ended up ultimately being at Buchenwald. And I still am not 100% sure all of the nitty-gritty details of what he did for the Nazis in Buchenwald, but whatever it was bad enough that at the end of World War II, this guy ended up getting convicted of crimes against humanity. Okay, now just think about this for a minute. Woodrow Wilson's point man on eugenics when he was governor of New Jersey, 3 decades later, is in Buchenwald collaborating with the Nazis to the point where he ends up, getting tried and convicted for crimes against humanity. Like that, to me, you would think that would be in most, if not all, detailed biographies of Woodrow Wilson, right? I have never seen any reference to that in any of the many, many books on Woodrow Wilson I've read. It's never, I think maybe one biography had a brief mention that he signed a eugenics bill when he was governor, but no detail on it or anything like that. And I've never seen any reference in any book on Woodrow Wilson to this particular guy who ended up at Buchenwald. The only reason that I discovered this bombshell detail was because while I was reading all these books on Woodrow Wilson, I also happened to be reading some books and articles specifically on the topic of eugenics, some of which were written by respected, credentialed historians. And it's one of those cases where, it's some combination of just sort of like the ignorance of specialists and possibly, at least in some cases, maybe some amount of ideological bias, right? If you're generally if you're writing a biography of Woodrow Wilson and you're generally trying to put him in a positive light, then, whether on purpose or just kind of by default, you might leave something like this out, right? But, somebody who's just simply writing a book or an article about the history of eugenics maybe isn't really thinking one way or the other about the implications of this fact for Woodrow Wilson's legacy. And so is just being a good, honest historian going, hey, look at this guy who worked with Woodrow Wilson on eugenics in New Jersey ended up eventually working with the Nazis. And so that's an example I would say where, because I'm not a super specialist, right? If I was only reading stuff on Woodrow Wilson, I probably would have never found this out. But because I was also reading specifically books on eugenics, I was able to, cross, right, whatever the term would be, not exactly cross-reference, but, make a connection that someone who's a super specialist might not have been able to make. And that sort of thing, I've been able to do that a number of times where, another one was when I was covering some of the unknown story of the origins of the Spanish-American War on a big episode a number of years ago. I uncovered a heck of a lot of circumstantial evidence that seems to point towards the USS Maine blowing up being something like a false flag. And the reason I was able to put together what I think is a pretty significant amount of circumstantial evidence. Now, I don't have the smoking gun, right? I don't have the letter from Teddy Roosevelt to some guy at the Office of Naval Intelligence saying, hey, blow up the Maine tomorrow so we can go to war, right? I don't have anything that blatant, but I've got so many different, individual things that just can't be coincidence when you add them all up that seem to show a U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, hand in the Maine blowing up. And the only reason I was able to put that together, if you just read books about Teddy Roosevelt and just read books about the Spanish-American War itself, you'll typically get the current mainstream consensus, which is the Maine wasn't blown up by the Spanish. It was purely an accident, right? Which I'm still willing to admit is quite possible. Like, I don't know for sure that it wasn't an accident, but you're never going to find the circumstantial evidence that I found because I was up to my eyeballs at the same time as I was reading about the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt. I was reading about the history of ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence. And I was able to find out that the number of connections of ONI to the Maine, both before and after its explosion, is just, one guy after another was involved in ONI and then also involved with the Maine somehow. And anyway, there's a lot more to the story than that, but that's just another case where, by being so omnivorous in the sources that I look at, I'm able to put together things that are almost kind of hidden in plain sight because the specialists in certain niches don't, know all the things that are related to their niche, but outside of it.
That brings me to something I wanted to ask you about. I think common knowledge these days would be something like, sure, these wars in our recent memories here, started by George Bush, his father, etc., not really a good idea. Those were a mistake. I think a lot of people could admit that now. People tend to now look at Vietnam as a mistake as well. And then you hear World War II, though, that was the necessary war. That was the good one. That's the heroic thing. We saved the world. And you don't hear much about World War I, at least in common discussions these days, and then certainly before that. And I wanted to ask you, which wars were legitimate, worth our time, and a good idea that we got into?
Man, that's a pretty tough one, because first off, I think there's a pretty good amount of BS in the origins of all of them. Like,
Okay.
it's hard to find a war where there's not at least something in how it started and how it was put together, very often how it was instigated, that's not really kind of shady and fishy and goes completely against the official story of like why the war happened and why it has to be fought. I mean, not that I can say that I've looked into every single American war in equal detail. Like, for example, I'm not super expert on the War of 1812. I know way more about it than most people walking around on the street, but I don't have the amount of expertise on the War of 1812 that I have on World War I or the Civil War or something like that. But even there, right, there's the ulterior motive of people like Henry Clay pushing for the War of 1812. One of their ulterior motives that doesn't get talked about much these days is they wanted to take over Canada. And that was, all the other stuff they were talking about, like, oh, they're messing with our sailors on the seas and whatever. For somebody like Henry Clay, that stuff is what weapons of mass destruction was for Bush going into Iraq. Like, it's not at all the real motivation for him, but it's the cover story, right? So you can actually go back and find Henry Clay, giving speeches in the Congress before the War of 1812, advocating for the war, and he's mostly ranting and raving about, oh, they're Shanghaiing our sailors and they're messing with our shipping, and yeah, we can't stand for this. Also, by the way, if we happen to go to war against them, we could use it as a cool opportunity to invade Canada. That'd be pretty sweet. Oh yeah, but we're really pissed about our sailors being messed with on the seas, though. That's the deal. And the Mexican War in the 1840s, there's some really shady stuff about how that exactly was instigated. And on and on and on. I mean, the American entry into World War I was basically a British intelligence operation from start to finish. In World War II, to some degree, same thing. And there's typically either a false flag or something that looks like it might be a false flag at the start, or there's something that I don't know if there's quite a word for this. Something like what instigated the Mexican-American War, or what instigated American entry into World War II. that being Pearl Harbor, where like Pearl Harbor, it's not a false flag. I don't see any reason to think that like the Japanese weren't actually flying those planes, and that wasn't actually the Japanese military attacking Pearl Harbor. On the other hand, like it's pretty clear to me that FDR kind of set that up in a way, right? That he deliberately instigated the Japanese to the point where they would do something, right? And there's a ton of evidence to point in that direction. And so I don't know what's the, like, we've got false flag, right, for when it's actually someone attacking themselves under false pretenses, but I don't know if we have a nice neat little tag word for what happened at Pearl Harbor, where it's like I'm trying to think, set up and stand down. That's a little bit wordy,
Right.
but I think that's a pretty good description of what happened at Pearl Harbor, and also to some degree what happened prior to the Mexican-American War, in a way, sort of some similarities to Fort Sumter, where it's like you're doing something deliberately designed to provoke the other side into shooting first, right? And that to me is like, that really muddies the waters on who's really the aggressor. That makes it a lot less clear cut, right? Because it's one thing if you're just walking down the street completely minding your own business and some random crazy jerk just runs up and sucker punches you in the face for no reason. Like, it's very clear you are just 100% the victim. They are 100% the aggressor and the bad guy. There's no real gray area there, right? But what if, on the other hand, you're harassing somebody verbally on the street? You're like getting in there, just being a complete asshole, and you're, in their face for a while, and then finally they lose it and take a swing at you and knock you out or whatever. It's now it's very complicated, right? Because on the one hand, you could say, well, he was the aggressor because he was the first one to go physical, right? You were just, assuming you weren't touching the guy, you were just like saying things to him and kind of following him and being annoying and whatever. Okay, fine. He's the first one to cross that line and make it physical. So in a way, he's the aggressor. But on the other hand, it's not like you're a blameless, completely innocent party who's just, being attacked by the forces of evil through no fault of your own, right? It's like, no, you kind of caused the incident to happen. And we could still say maybe that guy should have figured out something to do other than knocking you out. But at the same time, you are not the blameless, innocent victim that you're portraying yourself as. And I think that's kind of the story in a lot of the origins of America's wars. And even the American Revolutionary War, which is probably, yeah, I mean, it's got to be out of all the American wars, that's got to be the one that I'm at least the most sympathetic to, is the Revolutionary War. And I did a series on that forever ago that's still some of my most popular episodes. And I've got a lot of sympathy for a lot of aspects of the American Revolution and a lot of the people involved with it. But even there's some complications on a number of levels that make it not as clear cut as a lot of people see it as, particularly kind of like more, like patriotic right-winger types very often have a very, very simplistic view of the American Revolution. And they miss things like, first off, there were always kind of two factions of revolutionaries. There were the radicals who, really thought, hey, this War of Independence is not just about cutting the tie to London. It's about like really trying to see how far we can push human freedom here, right? This is your more kind of, Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, these sorts of guys. And then you've got the conservative revolutionaries, and I mean conservative in kind of the broad sense of the word. These were the guys who they wanted to cut the tie to London and no longer have a British elite kind of over them in the political structure anymore. But they didn't want any significant change beyond that. They wanted to keep American society and rules and everything largely the way it was. And these are guys much more like George Washington, who I honestly think George Washington would have been a Tory if a few things hadn't gone differently earlier in his life to piss him off at the British. If you look at his personality, his kind of socioeconomic status, his overall political attitude, George Washington really should have been a loyalist. But there were some things that happened to him earlier in life that caused him to specifically get pissed at the British. And so, he kind of wanted independence almost out of spite. But he didn't want any significant change beyond that. He still wanted, the people who were dominant and ruling American society to continue be dominant and rule American society. And that makes sense. He was one of the richest men in North America at the time. So why would he want, to significantly change the way things are done? So right from the get-go, you've got like two divergent factions on like, what's this whole revolution, this whole rebellion, what's it really about? Is it just about removing us from British jurisdiction and that's it? Or is it about something more kind of radically libertarian? Is it really supposed to be revolutionary? And so even there, it got kind of partially hijacked from early on by forces that were not on board with the kind of radical libertarian sort of ideology that we generally think of with, people like Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine or people like that. And then another thing that complicates the American Revolution is it doesn't take very long once independence is achieved for the new American government to start taxing Americans way more than the British were ever trying to do in the years leading up to the Revolution. If you actually go back and look at, and off the top of my head, I don't have the figures, but if you actually go look at those taxes, right, that the Sons of Liberty were rioting about and that ultimately people were rebelling over. Look at what those taxes were in terms of money. They were a joke. They were minuscule. And these guys were rebelling and protesting and rioting over the principle. They were over the principle. I don't care if these taxes are pennies. If we let them get away with taxing us in a way that we consider illegitimate, give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And so we've got to take a stand now over a couple of pennies on tea. Otherwise, who knows what they'll try tomorrow, right? And then, okay, you get independence and it takes just a few years before the new US government is making Americans pay far greater taxes to the US government than the British government was ever asking for. And, you're supposed to be okay with that because, well, it's your oligarchs doing it, right? It's your local warlords doing it. So somehow that makes it okay and legitimate, right? I mean, yeah, King George wanted to tax you at 1%. That's tyrannical because he lives farther away. Whereas, George Washington wanted to tax you several times that rate. Well, that's patriotic, right? That's doing your duty as a good citizen. So anyway, that's my complicated take on the American Revolution, which is like there's aspects of it I think are great, but it was kind of somewhat corrupted and diverted from pretty early on. My favorite kind of phase of the American Revolution is the first year or so. When you study like Lexington and Concord and some of that early stuff, like that to me that's the good stuff. That's when the people were largely leading themselves, and they had a fairly consistent kind of anti-authoritarian, kind of early proto-libertarian, attitude and worldview behind it. And then after, the first year or two, it increasingly gets hijacked by the more conservative oligarchical types.
Let's talk about one of my favorite sponsors of this show, and that is Paloma Verde over at palomaverdestore.com. It's a wonderful small business run by a great couple out of San Antonio, Texas. That would be Carlos and Vanessa. What will you find at palomaverdestore.com? All things CBD, everything you need in that regard. This is your one-stop shop. They've got CBD gummies, CBD pet products, CBD soft gels, tinctures, topicals, and you've heard me in the past rave about the sports cream. I'm going to rave about it again because it works very, very well. I cannot recommend it enough. You know who else recommends their products? My dog, Lux. He's about 10 years old now. He was not getting around as quickly as he used to until I started putting some of it on his food every morning. How cool is that? So I've got a promo code for you guys because you're loyal listeners of this show and they are loyal supporters. It is BUCK, B-U-C-K. At checkout, that will get you 25% off of any purchase over $75. And check this out. You sign up for their emails and then you'll get an extra 10% off, which will then give you a total of 35% off of your order. How cool is that? Again, that is promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, at checkout, palomaverdestore.com. Let's get back to the show.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about who you believe is the worst president in U.S. history. And I know your answer, but before we get to why you think that, I'd like to know if you were to survey, let's say, your classroom and say, students, go ahead and write down on a piece of paper who's the worst president in U.S. history before you teach them, by the way, like maybe day one. What would they say? Because I do find myself a little bit in a bubble sometimes in our circles, and the name Woodrow Wilson, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, those are thrown out very, very often. Almost every time I see people discuss the worst presidents in the United States. Who would your students say? What would be a common answer?
That's a really interesting question. Partly it's going to be, if I had to guess, I would say where I teach, it's mostly like red counties around here. It's mostly, pretty conservative. I'm in North Florida. So, the county I live in and all the counties around me went overwhelmingly for Trump twice.
Okay.
A lot of my students, they drive to school in like a giant old pickup truck, whatever. These are because it's a community college in a somewhat rural region. These are largely kind of blue collar people and generally conservative. Now it's complicated because we do have some Black and Latino students who maybe aren't as likely to be Republican, but predominantly it's a right wing area. And so I would guess that I wouldn't have a lot of people saying that the worst president is Donald Trump here. If I was teaching in a blue area, right? If I was teaching at a school in Portland or Austin or Asheville, North Carolina, I imagine I'd probably get overwhelmingly students saying Donald Trump's the worst president ever in history. Here, I don't know. I think they really, a lot of them really hated Obama because they were, just doing the typical Republican thing at the time. But I don't think they hate him as viscerally as like left-wingers typically hate Trump. I just don't see that. I don't know. I guess it's in part because Obama's such a smooth, charming, likable guy.
Right. And would their answer be so shallow of a depth of history? I find it funny for someone to say, and you're totally right, a lot of people in Austin would say Donald Trump. And that shows such a shallow version of history to answer the most recent guy that I hate.
Yeah. I'm not sure who they would say. Some of them, despite being mostly Republicans, I don't know, maybe a lot of them would still point to Nixon just because they've been told the narrative that you're generally told coming up, through the school system, which is that the idea of somebody like Nixon as a bad apple, right? That's the narrative. It's the same thing like when it's exposed that elements of the U.S. military have done like war crimes and atrocities, and the narrative always becomes that's a handful of bad apples, and you can't judge the whole thing by that, right? It's the same thing that you're told when it comes out that a cop did something really messed up. Oh, it's a bad apple. Don't worry about it. They're mostly good guys. And so that's generally, I think, how the presidency is taught, that they're mostly good guys who are at least well-intentioned. And, at worst, as you were saying before about some of these wars, they make, well-intentioned mistakes, right? Like Vietnam or the Iraq War. Those are just like well-intentioned little oopsies. But generally they mean well, the presidents, and they're generally decent guys. And, occasionally you get the rare bad apple like Nixon. And I think Trump may be being treated in the same way as Nixon, in the sense that he's being made the bad apple kind of scapegoat to divert attention away from the fact that all the presidents are a bunch of criminals and a bunch of monsters, with very few exceptions. And so, yeah, it serves the purpose of making the other presidents look better. If you can have one or two that you just consistently kind of shit on and say like, this is the worst guy ever. So yeah, I might get some Nixons. I might get some Obamas. I don't know. I would probably get very few Trumps. If I were to ask them, best presidents, I'd probably get a lot of people saying Trump, and I'd probably get a lot of people saying Reagan.
Okay.
I don't think I'd get a lot of people saying Bush, because even in this area, right, even in this very right-wing Republican area, there's not a huge amount of love for George W. Bush, which is fine. I consider W to be the worst president of my lifetime.
Sure.
So far. I mean, there's, as many horrible things as I could list off, Obama doing or Trump doing. or Biden starting to do. Still, so far at least, Biden hasn't done anything as terrible as what W did in my mind.
Yeah, I would have to second that as well. And so let's get to who's, in your opinion, the worst of all time. And I know you've done a lot of episodes of your podcast on this, so obviously you could talk for hours about it. But give my audience who hears people say, well, Woodrow Wilson was the worst, and they're not quite sure, maybe a few reasons as to why that could be.
Okay, I'm gonna try and keep this somewhat concise. All right, so I definitely, if I was listing like a bunch of what I consider the worst presidents in American history, definitely both of the Roosevelts. I think if you're any kind of a libertarian or even like a small government conservative, there's no way you can, if you actually know the history of the Roosevelts, there's no way you can think that they're good. Lyndon Johnson is another one who I think is one of the worst. I mean, just absolutely monstrous in many ways. Lincoln, of course, there's plenty of negative things to say there from kind of a libertarian perspective for sure. But yeah, to me, Wilson still, as of now, if a president starts World War III, I guess maybe he'll end up being worse than Wilson. We'll see. But as of right now, Wilson to me is the worst, and it's the quantity of negative marks on him. If you're from any kind of a pro-freedom perspective, right, from a moderately pro-freedom person to an anarchist, anywhere on that spectrum, you've got to see Wilson as just the worst when you add it all up. And it's a whole bunch of it's little things and big things combined. It's things that were kind of like short term and then things that have lasting legacies to this day. So just some of the reasons to not like Wilson. First off, he's one of the most racist presidents we've ever had. So, and I'm not a woke SJW or whatever, but I'm also not a racist. And so, that to me is a negative mark. And so there's that. And then there's he was very trigger happy interventionist even before World War I. He was very involved in sending American troops into Latin America and the Caribbean. He invaded Mexico twice. I'm actually going to do a whole episode just on Woodrow Wilson's Banana Wars. He invaded Mexico twice. He invaded and occupied Haiti and a whole bunch of other places in Latin America and the Caribbean. He got the United States into World War I, which I think was a disaster not only for the United States, but for the entire planet, because it caused World War I to end in such a messed up way that it almost guaranteed World War II was going to happen. And also the way that World War I ended. And Wilson doesn't deserve all the blame. There's also a lot of blame to give to the leaders of France and Britain. But Wilson deserves a lot of blame on a number of levels. The way the war ends also in terms of like the communists ultimately being able to take over in Russia and establish the Soviet Union. That is at least in part Wilson's fault. I wouldn't say it's all Wilson's fault for sure, but he deserves some of the blame for how that played out. Then you've got all the things he did domestically during wartime, very authoritarian measures, actually the worst president for sure when it comes to suppressing free speech and free expression. He did more suppression of free speech during World War I than either Lincoln did during the Civil War or FDR did during World War II. Thousands of Americans thrown into jail just for saying the wrong thing. And, very much kind of Crisis and Leviathan stuff, had the government take over significant areas of the economy and society that had never, went way beyond anything Lincoln had done during the Civil War. And the Civil War was 4 years long and it all happened in America. So you would assume like that's going to be where the government gets the most authoritarian and grows the most and whatever. But in fact, Wilson does more in World War I, which the United States is only in for like a year and a half, and which is fought on the other side of the world, and in which far fewer Americans serve and die than in the Civil War. And yet he does way more authoritarianism and kind of economic fascism at home, as well as suppressing free speech. So there's that. And then there's all of his domestic stuff that's not related to the war, which includes some pretty terrible stuff. Like he's the guy under whom the Federal Reserve gets passed, and it's not accurate to say that like Wilson was the sole driving force or originator behind the Federal Reserve Act. Like, no, this was, again, read Creature from Jekyll Island or something like that. And you get a sense like, oh, this was a project that the JP Morgan type people had been working on behind the scenes for years and years and years. Nonetheless, though, Wilson happened to be the guy who, was in the driver's seat when they finally got it through the Congress, and he happily signed it and supported it. So, he deserves some of the blame for that. He also presided over another long-running progressive dream that was passed in his first year of his presidency, 1913. A ton of stuff happens. Federal Reserve Act gets passed, and then the 16th Amendment, the income tax, that also gets passed during his first year as president. Again, not something that he originated, but something he happily supported as a good progressive and was happy to sign. So we get a permanent federal income tax. And then also, I think it's the 17th Amendment, which cut state legislators off from being represented at the federal level, because that's what the Senate was under the original configuration of the Constitution. The Senate was essentially like a UN assembly of the states. And so senators technically before 1913 represented state governments, not, the mass of citizenry of their states. And so that was another progressive long running thing that he presided over, putting into place, which then has long-term negative connotations for kind of like states' rights and state autonomy, because if senators no longer are beholden to their state government for their office, then they no longer have any sort of a vested interest to care when the federal government is intruding into state, prerogatives and states' rights. So, those are just some of the things I would say. And there's lots of other like little things here and there to dig up on Wilson. But when you add it all up, I mean, he deserves a fair amount of the blame for World War II happening. He deserves a fair amount of the blame for the Bolsheviks taking over in Russia. Not all the blame, but some of it. And just an absolute monster on civil liberties and free speech, all these sorts of things. He threw my favorite socialist in American history into prison for giving an anti-war speech, Eugene Debs, who, he got thrown in prison because Eugene Debs during World War I had the unmitigated gall to give a speech in which he said to America's young men, "You are fit for something other than being drafted and turned into cannon fodder." Mm-hmm. Like, that got him thrown into prison by Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, when the war ended, and some of the people who had been locked up under the Sedition and Espionage Acts during the war, some of them he pardoned or commuted and things like this. But Eugene Debs, he absolutely refused to budge. He said, "I'm not ever going to let that man out of prison as long as I'm president." And it was left to Warren Harding, his successor, who is, generally maligned as one of the worst presidents of all time by the establishment narrative. I happen to think he's actually not that bad. He's probably, Warren Harding, in my mind, is one of the least bad presidents we've had. And it was Warren Harding who came in and commuted Debs's sentence and let him out of prison. This elderly guy in bad health who was rotting in federal prison just for giving a speech. Right. So, there's a lot of consequences of the last 100 years still to this day from all the things Woodrow Wilson did. And he's particularly monstrous because he was so effective. Like, he got a lot of stuff done. And, you could say the same thing especially about FDR and about Lyndon Johnson in different ways. But I don't know. I think when you're looking at like big picture, long-term negative consequences, Woodrow Wilson's the champ, and he's so unlikable as a person too. That's another thing, from having read so much of his own words and read like probably at least a dozen biographies of him. I come away like he's just not a good person. Like, some of these guys, you get the sense, as screwed up as their ideas are and as many like horrible crimes as you could attribute to them, that just in like a personal way, like I get the sense that FDR is the kind of guy that, I don't know, you could have a nice conversation with and could be charming and whatever, like Barack Obama too, or, these sorts of people where you're like, he's still kind of charming and likable. And maybe that's just because he's a sociopath, but whatever. But Wilson, it's like, he's not even all that charming. Like, he could be an effective public speaker, but like person to person, he's just a very unlikable sort of a jerk in a lot of ways. And so there's that too. It makes it hard to even have a little bit of like personal sympathy. I admit every now and then I'll not that it in my mind relieves them of the guilt for whatever they did, but every now and then I'll be like, I don't know, maybe FDR like really did mean well. in his own way, he just had terrible ideas and was, acting on them. But he meant well. Wilson, like, I think he meant well in the sense that he believed in what he was doing. But he doesn't even have that personal redeeming charm in the same way that these other guys do.
Early on in this interview, you mentioned that it is tough for maybe a parent who's got a 15-year-old and you kind of get red pilled on the education system. And then it's like, well, he or she's only got a couple more years, I suppose. I don't know, maybe it's too late. Before we go, it's obviously at the end, I'm going to have you plug all of your shows and whatnot. But before we get to that point, I wanted to just get from you some advice to people, or maybe what are your thoughts on the education system, what a parent could do with their children, whether they're 7 or 15. What's kind of your pitch to people listening that are confused, concerned, not sure what they should do as far as the education system in this country goes?
Okay, yeah. I would say that the most important thing is actually the parent's relationship with the child. And that if the parent has like a really good, deep personal relationship with their child, where they're like really close and they talk to each other about important and consequential things. Not that every conversation has to be deep meaning of life or whatever, but that you do periodically, whether the child brings it up or the parent brings it up, you do periodically talk about like big questions and issues and philosophical questions and, big ideas and whatever. And also, have deep, meaningful conversations about current events and things like this. I think that if a parent has that kind of relationship with the child where there's mutual respect, like I'm a big advocate of sort of peaceful parenting type stuff, that then forms a bond that even if the child continues to go to public school or to go to a private school, it's, not a whole lot better, like just kind of a standard sort of a private school that's just an emulation, maybe a slightly better run, version of a public school or whatever. That even if the child continues to go to something like that, that if you have that sort of a deep, meaningful relationship with the child, you can have conversations about what they cover in school and, point out when there are contradictions or when there are gaps or when there are, important things not being said. And to give the child the sense that they should always be a critical thinker and a critical listener. They should always be aware that, there are potentially more sides to any story than what they're being presented with. And that a lot of what they're presented with is a particularly, ideologically structured narrative. And I think that if a kid going to school is aware of that and sees school almost as like a game, almost as like it's a thing where, a lot of what they say is either incorrect or doesn't adequately contain all the facts about a subject or whatever, they get a sense of school's limitations and get a sense that it's sort of a game that you can play, right? That, if you want to finish going through conventional school and get your high school degree so that you can then go pursue something in college, that's fine, but understand what it is. Like, don't assume that what you're being told is always the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I think that if you can do that and sort of model it in your own self as a parent, I think you can get it so that your kids are among those who, even if they go through the system all the way, come out not completely, ruined by it, right? And I think back to my own childhood. I went to public school my whole school age life, and somehow I came out of it still thinking for myself and not just going along and still always asking questions and doing my own research. And so, I'm an example of somebody that the system didn't fully work on. And so I think it's possible. And I give my parents some credit that my parents always encouraged me. They did make me go to school and everything, but at the same time, they always encouraged me to ask questions and to do my own research if I was interested in something, and to try and think for myself. I think they could have done even more than they did, but even the amount that they did was enough to prevent the system from fully working on me. And so I think a person, and I don't think my parents were like self-consciously trying to inoculate me against the effects of public school. I don't think they were deliberately doing that at all. I think they were just trying to encourage me to think for myself. So I think that a parent who was actually deliberately trying to sort of, if you're in a situation where for whatever reason you can't get your kid out of the system, but you see the system for what it is, that you can still somewhat inoculate them against the worst of its effects. And, you can even, I think if you kind of build the sort of relationship I'm talking about here with your kids, where you speak honestly with them at a sophisticated intellectual level, like they're adults, treat them like they're real people, not like they're pets, like a lot of people do with their kids. I think that you could probably do a pretty powerful job of insulating them from the worst effects of the system, as far as indoctrination of ideology, and as far as inculcating submission, obedience, and conformity. So, if you're able to and you wish to remove them from the system, obviously, all else being equal, that would be plan A, I would say. But yeah, I mean, that it doesn't mean though that if for whatever reason you're unable to do so, or unable to do so for a while, that like your kid is just doomed to completely take on all of the brainwashing of the system and end up, just another zombie. I think you can still, cultivate that relationship with the child, because if the child has a close relationship with the parents, that relationship is going to end up having way more influence on them psychologically and in terms of ideology and all that stuff than is whatever is being said at school. Whereas a child who does not have good, solid, close relationships and bonds with their parents, they're more likely to pick up a lot more of what is being broadcast in the schools, both from the teachers and whatever, but also from their peers, from their classmates. So yeah, I mean, I think that especially for kids younger than like mid-teens, a good sign that this bond is strong, like I'm talking about, would be if your kids actually enjoy spending time and doing things with the parents, even when the parents don't make them. Like if your kids actually want to hang out with you a lot of the time, not that they have to all the time, not that they can't have, their own friends their age or whatever too, but like if your kids actually want to spend time with you, that's a good sign that you're on the right track. And then probably that means that your influence on the kid is going to be way more. And I've heard plenty of teachers that I know, like public school teachers, say that, and these are often kind of blue-pilled people who just, believe the standard version of everything, but they'll still sort of say, man, no matter what I try to do, to teach these kids, or, especially like teachers who deal with a lot of kids coming from broken homes and poverty and whatever, right? For whom school might actually be a nicer place than their home, like those sorts of kids, right? They'll often say, man, no matter what we try and do to uplift these kids and help them do better and learn better ways to, go through life and whatever, man, their home still just does way more, right? Their home makes a way bigger impact on their habits and their personality and whatever, compared to what we do, right? And so that's in a negative sense, right? That's in the sense of talking about kids coming from dysfunctional homes and broken homes and whatever, and abusive homes, for whom the public school might actually be a net, better place to be. Right. And so why wouldn't that also be true in a positive case, right? Where the parent is providing a good, supportive, loving home that's encouraging creativity and independent thought and individuality and thinking for yourself. Why can't the parent's relationship also be dominant there, even if the child is going to school still?
Well put then. Well, let's plug away. I want you to tell my audience about your podcast, how they can support you. I want you to tell them about that too, where to find you online, all of it.
Okay, so the show is the Dangerous History Podcast. I've been making it since the summer of 2014, so it'll be coming up on a 7-year anniversary in a few months. And I've got over 200 episodes, as well as a few dozen bonus episodes for supporters of my show. And the podcast is available at all the usual podcast syndication venues. Dangerous History Podcast, you should be able to find it. my website. If you put in dangeroushistorypodcast.com, that will take you right to my homepage. You could also, follow the show and my work on social media and all that stuff. And yeah, for those who want to support my work, who get value out of what I'm doing and want to help keep me doing it, and maybe even encourage me to do it and be able to do it more in the future, you can support me right now through Patreon or Subscribestar. I know, there's people who have issues with Patreon and whatever, so I've got Subscribestar as an alternative there. It's possible some more avenues of support will be available in the near future. Working on a few things there. But yeah, if you support my work, depending on the level of support, you get access to various types of bonus materials, bonus episodes, all that sort of stuff, many additional hours of Dangerous History Podcast. You get access to the private Facebook group for supporters of the show, all that kind of good stuff. And, my bonus episodes vary a lot, but some of them are as big and complicated as my regular episodes. Like when I was doing a series on the Civil War, I did bonus episodes on certain aspects of the Civil War. Like I did a 2-part series on the naval aspects of the Civil War, which very few people know much about at all. I did a 2-part series on kind of like weapons and tactics of the Civil War, like really digging into like, how did these guys actually fight? What weapons were they using and how were they really using them? Because a lot of what people think is inaccurate, literally, about what was happening in the Civil War. There's a lot of BS out there about, these guys were shooting each other consistently at 400 yards. It's just not at all true. I've got an episode about what I call Corporate Abe, who is the other side of the Abraham Lincoln administration, the stuff you don't hear about, where he's like giving away land and money to railroad companies and, giving money and power to the banks and all those sorts of things. So anyway, yeah, got a lot of bonus materials for those who wish to support my work. The Dangerous History Podcast, check it out. I'm currently in the middle of a non-consecutive zillion-hour series on the life and career of Woodrow Wilson, who we've been talking about today. So if the things that I've said here about Woodrow Wilson really piqued your interest, definitely go over and check out my episodes. I just got to where he's elected president, so there's still, the worst is by far yet to come.
That sounds enticing. The worst is yet to come. CJ Killmer from the Dangerous History Podcast.
All right, what a great conversation with CJ Killmer.
You're welcome.
I was
my pleasure.
happy to do that.
Yes,
history has always been my favorite subject in school, and it's wonderful to get the real takes on American history. So I was glad to have you on, CJ, and I love the podcast. You guys check out the Dangerous History Podcast. As for us, I've got the YouTube channel. A lot of you know that. I shouldn't say most of you, because the numbers of the people that listen to this show, they're much more than the ones that just watch the YouTube. I'll put it that way. And that is partially on me because I never advertise it. I rarely talk about it. The salesman thing's not in my blood. So I've got to write all of this stuff down and remind myself, hey, talk about the YouTube channel. So if you do consume any content via YouTube, give us a shot on there. Counterflow with Buck Johnson once you're on YouTube, and it will take you right to where you need to be. I do put out videos of all of these interviews that I'm doing. So if you like that form, go ahead and give us a look over there. Maybe leave some comments, some likes, all of that kind of stuff. Speaking of that, ratings and reviews on iTunes, that's always helpful. It gets this show out there with their algorithm and puts it in front of more eyes. Let's put it that way. The Telegram group, my favorite thing to wake up to and read articles from and chat with the people in the group. It's on the Telegram app. You just search Counterflow with Buck Johnson and you will find our room. Lots of good people in there, listeners of the show. It's like they're becoming friends now. It's really nice to chat with all of you that are in there. And let's see, the website, it's still deathtotyrantspodcast.com. We're working on getting that switched over. However, once you go there, it is all Counterflow. The website has been rebranded. It's got all the episodes. It's got the link to the Patreon supporters group, which you can become a part of as well, of course. And here are our Patreon exclusive episodes. I need to make a new one quite soon. We'll do that shortly. Otherwise, that's about all I got. You guys, thanks for being here once again. Buck Johnson, Counterflow Podcast. We will see you next week.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your science with the power power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.